Good morning and welcome. I'm Vicky Moffat, CEO of Chapter Zero, and today's webinar is brought to you by Chapter Zero in partnership with Chronos Sustainability and the London Stock Exchange Group. Our purpose at Chapter Zero is to equip and inspire directors to lead on climate from the boardroom, and we really hope our topic of transition planning today will accelerate that. I'd like to begin by introducing our speakers. And you can see here on the slide, we have Rory Sullivan, CEO of Chronos Sustainability. And Rory is also visiting Professor of Geography and Environment at LSE. Welcome to Rory. We have Julie Baddeley, my chair at Chapter Zero in the UK. And Julie also chairs our global entity, the Climate Governance Initiative. Julie has a 20-year career working in large public and private boardrooms, and she is also co-chair of the Transition Planning Task Force Sector Guidance Group. Devyani Vaishampayan is, and we're proud to say, a Chapter Zero Fellow, as well as a Portfolio Non-Executive Director, REMCO Chair. She is a renowned speaker and thought leader in the area of sustainability and governance. We have Jane Goodland today. Welcome, Group Head of Sustainability at the London Stock Exchange Group. And Jane has worked for 25 years at the vanguard of sustainable and responsible investment. And last but not least, Mark Manning. We're very pleased that Mark is also an advisor to Chapter Zero. Mark is a very experienced luminary in policy, risk and regulation, formerly from the FCA. And Mark also co-chairs the TPT delivery group on the disclosure framework. So welcome to all of our speakers who you will meet shortly. So let's have a look at the agenda for today, and what you can expect from today's event is actually for us to look at the role of the board in overseeing quality transition plans. We're going to have a focus on the investor perspective that Rory will look at today. And we will start to answer the question, how you can integrate climate risk and opportunity into business strategy. We have at Chapter Zero developed a dedicated transition planning toolkit for non-executive directors and boards, and Julie will take you through that today, and we will have time for Q&A around that. So just to set up the topic of transition planning, because many of you will be very advanced in this and some of you will be new to it, the Transition Planning Task Force was set up by HM Treasury 2 years ago, actually as an opportunity to continue UK PLC's leadership globally around climate change. And it is a new regulatory framework, or it will be, as well as guidance, to encourage businesses to develop plans on how they will transition to a low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient economy. Now, it has been designed to be the gold standard for private sector transition plans. And it has actually been put together by an accomplished body of representatives from across academia, industry, regulatory authorities, and civil society. And it is currently voluntary, although the FCA will be consulting on the inclusion of TPT guidance when implementing ISSB standards. I think what's important is that it has been designed to be working in alignment with TCFD, ISSB, GFANS, so that it is joined up and not yet another regulatory imperative, but actually working in the same direction. It is likely to become mandatory for listed companies, asset managers, and FCA regulated asset owners, possibly as early as the accounting period of January next year in 2025. But actually, it is so much more than a regulatory framework. It helps us and has been designed to speed us up in answering the question, how can we embed climate into business strategy? And as such, it is a carefully designed exercise in strategic change and sits squarely, therefore, in the territory of board oversight. What I find exciting about it is that it is very much forward-looking. It does actually have one of the 5 pillars focused around governance. and there is fantastic sector guidance and really, really helpful case studies that I would encourage you to look at. But boards are all at different places. Many of you are publishing for the third time, and some of you are beginning on that journey. The important thing is to get started. And we're very, very happy to have over 270 guests with us today and members. And what I'd like to do now is actually ask you for a short poll to see where you are in your boardrooms on the journey of transition planning. And perhaps what you could do is think about one of your boards and answer these questions. And actually, sorry, that's the wrong question. I've just seen that. We put up the how far advanced we are on transition. That's the right question, thank you. So if you take a minute to think about how far you are on the journey, and we'll wait to see the results from the 270 directors we have with us today. And here we have the great reveal. So we can see here that actually 45% of you have not yet published a transition plan, and 16% of you feel that actually you're quite leading in this area, and you've put it as a fundamental part of your business strategy. And I think one of the great things about the peer exchange in Chapter 0 is that we can learn from each other and discuss together how to do this well. So thank you for that poll. And I'd now like to pass to Rory Sullivan, who's going to take us through the investor perspective on transition planning and boardrooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, and good morning, everybody. Now, I'm basically the bridge between Vicky and Julie. So I'm going to ask a set of questions, and then Julie is going to explain how the Transition Planning Toolkit developed by Chapter 0 helps you to answer them. The topic I've been asked to comment on is how do investors look at transition plans? I'm going to do three things. I'm going to start by explaining the why, the what, and the how of investors and how they look at transition planning. I'm then going to talk briefly about what investors will be looking for when they look at the transition plan documents or reports that companies publish. And I'm then going to ask or describe what questions investors will ask when they speak with boards about transition planning. So turning first to the why, what, and how. So the why is, I'm assuming it's going to be self-evident to everybody on the call today, but is worth reiterating. Why are we concerned about transition planning and about climate change? Well, the short answer is it is a material driver of financial returns for many companies, and indeed all companies eventually. It's a drive. It will shape strategy. It will influence CapEx, it will define new opportunities, and will define perhaps risks that that you need to manage. So it is very clear that this is an issue that is relevant to how investors will look at companies. So that's the why. What do investors look at when they think about transition planning or when they're looking at companies? Investors are interested in their own commitments on net zero, and how do the companies and entities in which they invest enable investors to meet their goals at a portfolio level. Investors are interested in understanding the seriousness with which companies look at climate-related risks and opportunities. Investors are interested in understanding the actuality of the risks and opportunities and the financial implications of those. Investors are interested in understanding how companies are progressing and how they're positioning their businesses to respond to those risks and opportunities. So that's the what. How will investors use the information in turn? And the slide sort of follows logically from my previous points. Investors will use it to inform their investment views on companies and other entities. Is this a well-run company? Is this a company whose management and board is on top of a major risk? What are the strategic risks and opportunities faced by the company? How is the company positioning itself to respond to them? So classic investment analysis, investment decision-making from a fundamental perspective. Investors will also use transition plans to inform their assessment of companies' quality of management, the relative performance and positioning of companies. Investors also will use transition plans to engage with companies, so it's a basis for dialogue. It is an opportunity for companies to shape and influence the narrative they have with their investors. And investors will inevitably use transition planning in voting. It would probably start with, have you got a transition plan or not? And Vicky, I thought it was interesting that something around half of the respondents to the survey have no plans to produce a transition plan, which is striking given that investors have signaled that they're looking to companies to produce these plans. So I suspect voting season in 2025 could be quite interesting around transition planning. And investors will use the information transition plans both to assess companies' own performance and to allow investors to assess, for example, the effectiveness of their engagement. So that is the what, the why, the what, and the how. So it's a classic 3-bullet point opening commentary. If we could turn to the next slide, please. So the next slide is, it should really be titled, what do investors expect from the transition plan documents, from the reports that companies produce? So what are investors looking for? Well, they're looking for the elements set out in the Transition Plan Task Force's recommendations and in the recommendations and additional guidance in the sector supplements or the additional sector guidance. But the key thing investors are looking for is they're looking to understand how well a company's commitment to net zero or to action on climate change feeds through into the concrete things that drive company action and performance. So most obviously objectives and targets, and that covers points like how ambitious are those objectives and targets? Do they align with commitment? Are they enough to drive short-term performance, not just out in 2040 or 2050, out in never land, but here and now? Investors are interested in how climate-related risks and opportunities affect company strategy. So what's the company going to do? They are very interested, of course, and unsurprisingly, in how transition planning affects both CapEx and OpEx. So often a lot of these discussions are about CapEx and assuming that many of the answers are big investments, but of course, this will also affect cash flows, it will affect margins, it will affect operating costs. So investors are interested in those, and investors are also interested in risk. Now, they're interested in risk from a number of different perspectives. One is, of course, that climate change presents risks and opportunities to companies, but investors are also interested in the risks to strategy. So what happens if something goes wrong? So what happens if, for example, governments don't move as quickly towards net zero as we would like, or if the incentives in the real economy are not those that are needed? So investors expect the transition plan, our transition plan documents, to explain what's the company or entity committed to, how is it going to get there, how much is it going to cost, what's it going to do, and then over time, as these are produced annually, to track and report on progress and to explain what's affected performance, what might have slowed things down, and also areas where external factors have allowed performance to be better than it might otherwise have been. So that's the document, the written document. Now, the next slide, please. The next slide is the point at which investors walk into the room and talk with boards or with non-execs. So the first point is that investors expect the board to know about transition planning. You know, I mean, I think our experience in other areas of sustainability has often been that sustainability and similar reports have been produced and okay, the board might have technically signed off on it, but it was, I mean, my experience was it was not unusual to find board members who hadn't read the report, weren't familiar with it, or when asked what it contained, sort of fell back to talking about the company's efforts on philanthropy and social responsibility, not about strategy. So investors expect boards to know what's in the transition plan. They expect boards to be able to talk competently about the transition plan. You know, this isn't over here on the side or something one deals with once, you know, you've done all the other important things you need to do in running a business. Investors expect boards and NEDs to be able to explain how does climate change affect their strategy, how does it affect CapEx, and how does it alter the decisions they would otherwise have made. And that point around trade-offs is really important. This is transition plans and transition planning for most companies is not an endorsement of a business as usual strategy. It often requires changes in what you're going to do, where you're going to spend money, what objectives you set for the business. So investors expect board members to be able to explain those trade-offs and to explain how the transition plan enables the company to be successful over the longer term. I think the other thing that is often missing in boards is investors expect boards to champion this. You know, too often boards see this as being something, well, we've got to talk about it once, and then we forget about it. Whereas actually investors expect boards to be the face of the public communication on the plan, to signal their personal commitment to the plan, and they expect boards to intervene if it turns out the plan is not being successful, or if goals and objectives are not being met. So I guess to conclude, I've set out the why, the what, and the how from an investor perspective. I've given a sense of what the document needs to cover, but in many ways, the Work Transition Plan Task Force, and Mark will talk more about this later on, sets that out. I think the critical thing is that it doesn't end with the document. It doesn't end with writing it down. The rubber starts to hit the road when investors come in and start talking to boards about, do you understand this? Are you committed to it? Are you ensuring it's being implemented? And are you ensuring it's being effective? That is a very demanding agenda for boards. This is a relatively new area for many. It's an area where the expectations of boards and of individuals on board, so the individual NEDs and the senior independent director and the chair are evolving. Chapter 0's project, developing board guidance for non-execs on developing, implementing transition plans, is the bridge between what I've set out as the investor demand and what I think what boards need to be able to do. So with that seamless segue, I'm going to hand over to Julie Badley of Chapter 0. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rory, very much. And thank you also to the Chronos team generally for all the work that you put into helping develop this toolkit for us. It was fantastic, and I think it's going to make a real difference to people in the boardroom. So having spent 2 years working with the TPT team, I've come to understand even more than before when we started Chapter 0, how important transition planning is and how complex and multifaceted it can be. This is not an easy lift for boards, and most of us have not got a background that will make it easy for us to drive these plans from the boardroom. Hence the TPT guidance, which I really commend you to look at. I know there's a lot of it and it's very detailed, but actually it's incredibly helpful. And I found it, working with that team and reading the outcome, I found it really useful within my own board scenes. But also we've developed the toolkit in order to sort of, as Rory says, bridge that very detailed guidance for the non-executive audience, so that we as non-execs can understand our role in transition planning, what sort of questions we need to ask, how we can judge how well our companies are doing, because it's not an easy thing to develop the plan, but it's also not straightforward to judge the quality of it. Most of us have never done a transition plan for a net zero world before, I think would be fair to say. So I think companies lack skills and expertise on this. We need to be able to build plans that are robust and fully integrated into business strategy. And we haven't grown a generation of finance people, operations, product design, IT, HR, even marketing people who know how to do this. So we're having to play catch up to an extent, and that makes the role of the board even more vital. We need to ensure the right resources are in place to do the job and that accountability is clear. We need to challenge the ambitions and the short-term goals, because many companies set out ambitions 2-3 years ago after COP26, but few at the time had a clear view of how they were going to get there, and the short-term goals were not in place. We need to be able to challenge the assumptions that have gone into the plan, as with any business strategy. And we need to be able to build these plans effectively into incentives for our exec teams. So the Transition Planning Toolkit is Chapter 0's response to help our members play their role in this important work. It was built by experts, but informed by many of our members who helped shape and test it. So just briefly, why focus on transition planning now? I mean, I probably don't need to tell anyone on this call, the imperative is here. We need to halve emissions by 2030, and they're still rising. Some recent predictions say that at this rate, we won't have reached net zero by 2100. Global temperature rise exceeded 2 degrees several times in February. And there's an increased risk of breaching tipping points. We're not any longer in control. And the notion that we can overshoot this target and then pull back is not supported by the science. So our Chapter 0 view is that only business can really tackle this issue, and business can do so if we have the will, the resources, and a supportive policy landscape. So as Rory has highlighted, investors will assess the plans to establish which of our companies has a sustainable investable proposition, as will banks, of course, when they're considering their lending. This is not just about equity, this is also about balance sheet lending. So without a doubt, I think we are heading for a disruptive transition from a policy perspective. At this rate, we will approach 2030 nowhere near where we need to be. And the world will have to take drastic action, which probably means sharp policy changes. And that action will be needed either to reach net zero or to adapt to droughts, sea level rises, migration, etc. And recent policy U-turns make it even more likely that this will not be a smooth managed process. So board leadership is key, especially when there's a growing fatigue with ESG and the amount of disclosure required globally. So now just to talk about the toolkit itself, it's made up of 4 parts. I hope you've all looked at it. Many of you have filled in the scorecard already, so you are familiar with that. But it's 4 parts, and the goal is to create debate in the boardroom. We've modeled this on the highly successful Chapter 0 board toolkit and scorecard. And if you haven't used that already and your company is at the early stages of considering transition planning, we would recommend that you look at the board's scorecard first and then come to the transition planning detail. The toolkit provides a briefing on transition planning within the UK reporting landscape and on the key role of non-executive directors. It also contains a simple set of questions to get you started, particularly for those who answered the poll earlier to say their board isn't very advanced on this. Then there's a scorecard to help you map where your organization is on the transition planning journey and how ready you are for transition planning disclosure. The governance section provides a guide for board committee chairs and members, since all the committees have a part to play in the governance of transition planning. It will help you consider how your committee's work aligns with and supports the company's strategic ambition and transition plan. And finally, there's an overview of the barriers and enablers which will determine how successful your organization is with its transition planning and implementation. So parts 1 and 4 are primarily for pre-reading. Part 2 is designed to stimulate debate. And the value of completing this scorecard comes in part from your own assessment, suggesting what areas need attention and pushing the board discussion. But even more important is the variation in scores, which can be flushed out by a range of board members completing it, and those who interact with the board on transition planning who may have a different view on how advanced the company is from the board itself. So if possible, ask your company secretary to get every board member to complete it. You might have to push that one forward with your chair, but to get the maximum value out of this, all board members would complete the scorecard, and then you can analyze where the high and low scores sit. But it's also really useful just to use it yourself. It will help you prepare for a healthy board discussion, or certainly get the Sustainability Committee or ESG Committee, whatever it's called in your company, to score the company to help their work. This is a bit like an annual board evaluation review, which we're all so familiar with, but it's specifically focused on climate and transition planning. It's quite valuable to get those who report to the board or its committees on environmental matters to see if their view of where the business is corresponds to that of the board members themselves. And sometimes you may find they don't think the board is quite as far advanced as perhaps the board thinks it is. So we got many of you before this event to complete a scorecard and send it in to us. This is all anonymous. We don't keep a record of who's filled it in and which company. This is for your benefit. But it was interesting because there was a really big spread of scores, with the highest total at 86 out of 100 across all the questions, and the lowest at 21. Which shows, that we do have the opportunity within Chapter 0 to share a lot of absolutely brilliant learnings between those who are further advanced and those who are just getting started. And I think there's probably not a great surprise in how the scores are mapped out, in that the highest scoring section was the early stage of assessing or reassessing where you are in your planning, and the lowest was about implementation. I mean, that's a timing factor as much as anything else. But I found myself with my own FTSE 250 board, it was really interesting completing this scorecard. And for me, one of the takeaways was that actually we've spent more time in a way looking at the risks and the cost side of this and less on the innovation opportunities, which was something that I was then able to take back into the boardroom. So that's a bit about the scorecard. As I said, part 3 is there for committee chairs and members. And all of these committees have their part to play. The nominations committee in ensuring that relevant skills are on the board, either through appointment or education. And encouraging board members to be members of Chapter 0 is a helpful part of the education side of that. Audit committees have to scrutinise disclosure and risk assessment and feed their thoughts back into the board itself. And remuneration committees, of course, are making sure that incentives are in place to drive the transition. And investors are very focused on that already in terms of what sort of measures are being put in place, both for LTIPs, but also for annual bonus plans. So part 4 looks at a bit at barriers to successful planning and implementation. This is something that is based really on Chapter 0 members' experience of business transformation. Climate is a business transformation challenge. It just happens to have some particular ingredients like the time horizons, the uncertainty of the context that you're going to be working in. There's some particular challenges around climate, but it is basically a business transformation challenge. So these sort of barriers that come up, many of them are common to when you conduct any other sort of major change in your business. But the ones that we particularly picked out for part 4 are moving beyond compliance and controls, because a lot of boards are finding that the plethora of acronyms that they're required to report against is really taking too much board energy and oxygen, which means that the thinking going into the planning is being drowned out by some of the controls and compliance standards. My board has 13 different reporting disclosure frameworks that it has to report against, which is sort of overwhelming for any group of execs. We need to invest in skills because we probably, as I said earlier, don't have them all in place. We have massive uncertainty and ambiguity to manage, particularly in the policy landscape. We need to recognize in the boardroom that there is sometimes an unconscious bias going on in terms of our decision making. None of us, and from my grey hair, you can see how long I've been on boards, none of us like to say we got things wrong in the past, or, there's a tendency for us to try and make decisions incrementally rather than look at the at the really new ingredients that are coming into play that might drive our decisions in a different direction. We need to prepare for the resistance to change that may very well come through both in our direct organization, but maybe through our supply chain and even through our customer base, which may espouse environmentally sound products, but not necessarily buy them. And we need a dynamic and iterative approach for this. It's not, the investors do not expect us to get this plan right first time. We've had a lot of feedback on that. A lot of boards are afraid to publish a plan and then go back and know they've got to change it. But we've had a lot of feedback that says, just get it out there. We recognize it's going to be iterative. We recognize the first 3 plans may, will build on each other. So take this dynamic and iterative approach. So before I hand over to Devyani to get that real life perspective on this discussion, I thought just one more poll, if I may, which was to ask you which of these barriers you are seeing in your boardroom discussions around transition planning. You can tick as many as you like, but are you finding that massive reporting frameworks is causing a problem, or is it actually helping you distill out the answers? I shall talk while I wait for people to vote. Do you think your board has all the competencies it needs, or do we need to refresh and build and educate? Are you finding that uncertainty around the policy landscape, or even the sort of timing of when big climate issues are going to hit your company? Is that a major problem for you? Have you already encountered resistance to change? We've all seen the farmers blocking the Brussels streets. There can be very strong resistance to some of the decisions that have to be made. And are you trying to get the perfect plan in place and your board worrying about publishing something that may not be spot on? Have we got results of that? That's really, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I guess that the last one is lower, partly because a lot of the people on our call are not quite as far on the journey. But I think it's interesting to see that many of you are seeing a lot of the barriers that we've attempted to address in the toolkit. So I'm going to hand over to Devyani, but I wish you every success with your transition planning, and please use the toolkit. Please give us feedback on the scorecard, on the toolkit itself. Chapter 0 is only as good as the feedback we can get from our members, which enable us to improve. So we really value your input. And at that point, I will hand over to Devyani to bring it all to life.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. And I guess it's very clear that the toolkit can be very helpful, particularly for NEDs and boards who are early on in the journey to embed climate change in the business strategy. But of course, I think practical implementation always has its own issues and challenges. So I'm really glad today we have Jane from the London Stock Exchange and Vicky, who's the CEO of Chapter 0, to share their own experiences of implementing the toolkit or getting started on the journey. Jane, I actually wanted to start with you because it was interesting in the poll that more than 50% of the participants are still in the very early stages. And having been a NED and looking after ESG in 2 boards, I found the initial phase of getting the discussion off the ground, getting a sense of urgency around the issue, getting alignment, far more challenging than the stage when you then start launching the toolkit or start using it. I was wondering if you could share your approach at the London Stock Exchange and what was helpful and what probably could have been done differently.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Chapter 0 for inviting me to the panel today. I think it's super interesting. I guess the first thing to say is we're not done. So this is, I'm making kind of comments in the context of an ongoing process. So, and like many organizations, we are, we are sort of some way through the process, and we are certainly not looking at this with hindsight saying, oh, we're all finished. So the first thing to be really clear about is this is a dynamic, iterative process. I think for us, we made a significant acquisition in 2021, and it provided a really kind of opportune moment for us to think about our new enlarged organisation, and a great kind of trigger to say, okay, let's think about our climate transition plan. So we began with engaging with the board around what our near-term targets would be for 2030. And so that was an early engagement, and that led to the following year us publishing our first climate transition plan in 2022, and a decision to take it to the AGM, because we really felt that it was important to create that level of transparency and engagement with shareholders. And of course, we engaged with shareholders ahead of the AGM to test out what we were planning to publish and whether or not that was something would be well received or not. And we received some feedback. And you know, happy to say that we did receive overwhelming support from that first AGM and the resolution on the climate transition plan, which I think set us on the right path. What I'd say is, since then, we've been engaging with the board from an executive perspective on a regular basis about progress towards the plan. What I would say is that the specific targets that are part of the plan at present focus on our operational emissions and our supply chain emissions. It's significant to say, because it's really important that each and every plan is very tailored to the specific organisation. So for an organisation like LSEG, the vast majority of our emissions sit in our scope 3, our purchased goods and services. And so our supplier engagement and our targets around those are very critical. So we have regular engagement with the board around progress, and the toolkit comes at a brilliant time, because we are looking to be a bit more specific around measuring our kind of our progress going forward. And the toolkit provides a really practical way and a quantitative way to be able to mark our progress. And so we'll be using that going forward. And certainly we've been testing out the toolkit within my team and at the executive level to determine kind of where we think we are, and that will inform a conversation with the board going forward. But over the last 2 years, we've been focusing on things like making sure that we've got clarity of roles and responsibilities at the board level and the subcommittee levels, and also ensuring that, you know, climate is a regular part of the board updates that are being received. So yeah, I'd conclude on that bit by saying we're still in the process.
Yeah, and what were some of your frustrations and challenges?
I think that for us, I think it's just about the time necessary to genuinely give this the time needed. And that's quite difficult on a busier board agenda, you know. So I think that's one area that it can be tricky to get kind of the time needed. But then, of course, there are other ways to think about kind of board engagement outside of that typical cycle, potentially. So that's, I suppose, one of the key barriers. And also, I suppose that because of its nature, it is an ongoing process. So it's difficult to kind of report to the board, say, tick, you know, we've done, you know, it's done. So I suppose that sometimes there is a tendency to want to kind of know that things are completed and it's all tied up. But this is an ongoing process, which does require the board to develop skills and understanding of the climate agenda, which itself is a bit of a moving feast as well.
Right. Well, yeah, that was really useful, Jane. Thank you. Vicky, you've used the toolkit with a number of boards, FTSE boards. And I think we've had a glimpse into the scoring and how that could vary quite a bit. And so I'm sure it's not uncommon that within the same board, you could have different board members. The output from them could look quite different. So, was there variation in board member views when you worked with boards around the toolkit?
Yeah, thank you, Devyani. I mean, we've worked both formally and informally at Chapter Zero with, as you say, FTSE 350, FTSE 100, and other AIM-listed and other companies, both informally and formally. And I think there are two key areas that keep coming up. And one is risk. And actually, many organizations are still working from a single materiality perspective. And that is increasingly a problem. And I think we're going to see double materiality becoming more and more important, both the impact of the entity on the climate and the impact of the climate on the entity. And so there are a lot of discussions that are actually teased out through the scorecard in particular around risk, and particularly physical climate risk. As Julie mentioned earlier, we've exceeded 1.5, we're at 2 degrees now. At many times in February, we reached 2 degrees. And so getting a handle on risk is a really, really difficult question. I think the other thing, and this is particularly coming up with the chairs group, is this short-term versus longer-term dilemma. And of course, transition planning is by definition a longer-term trajectory, but actually how you manage that. And there's a huge polarity and debate and discussion, I think, that this scorecard in particular has helped with inside boardrooms to tease out short versus long-term views.
That's true. Actually, I think trying to prioritize is always difficult, and the toolkit, I think, can play a big role around that. But what surprised you most about responses to the questions?
Well, I don't know what you'd say, Jane, but actually thinking that there are many organizations who haven't published, who actually are further ahead than they perhaps realized, because they have been reporting now for many years, perhaps not in the framework of transition planning, but this isn't new. It's just a new, perhaps forward-looking, a new urgency. And I think it was surprising to many directors that actually there's more happening than they initially realized they might. And I think there is a lot of, if I may say, sort of uncertainty around transition planning. All of us are struggling with, how to begin, what is it all about? But actually a new confidence that has come through by working with this toolkit to say, actually, we're not doing as badly as we thought. And more importantly, we're not communicating across multi-stakeholder groups as much as we could do. And there's a sense of fear sometimes around greenwash, but actually an opportunity to take a lot of the great work that is happening and make it more front and center, both within culture and within that stakeholder communication.
And did you see that particularly so in certain industries or sectors? Because, having worked in the energy sector myself, I think health and safety, the whole foundation for how do you do it, approach it, measurement, linking to incentives is so robust and ingrained. And that, therefore, the transition to climate planning, then I'm sure, is far easier for some of these sectors as compared to others. So any observations around that?
Yes, I mean, I think I would encourage everyone to look at the TPT sector guidance, because as you rightly say, the answers to these questions are so different sector to sector. Again, what's optimistic is that we are seeing tipping points in certain sectors that are moving faster than others. I think the big one sitting in London is the financial sector, and Jane will have plenty of views about that.
So Jane, have you all used the TPT framework? Did you find it useful?
Yeah, I mean, we actually we've been involved with the development of the TPT framework from the outset, actually, and we've been really keen to ensure that it remains useful and practical. A number of times we've mentioned this kind of complexity of regulation, and depending on where your organization is operating and domiciled, then that could be really quite significant. And so I think it's really important where we see kind of tools and frameworks such as TPT coming in, that they are really focused on the practicalities of making this real. And I think the TPT framework does that very well. The other point to note is around the interoperability of TPT and the way in which it kind of works with other existing disclosure frameworks as well. So, for example, with the ISSB standards, or indeed the CSRD regime in the EU. So, and I think that does that really well, because it's really a build on what the existing disclosure requirements are, and of course TCFD and ISS being together. So we used it to create our updated climate transition plan. And I think it's a very useful framework, basically. And it allows you to kind of quite easily see the areas which still need some evolution, but to be able to explain that. So, you know, we've been very clear about the areas where we've still work to do.
Right. And I think Julie referred to it earlier to say it can feel a bit scary when you have all these various kind of, you know, almost versions or tracks that you need to adhere to. But what you're saying is the interoperability aspect is actually easier than people think it could be.
Yes, yes, indeed. And they're all sort of trying to do slightly different things, and it can be overwhelming. And I absolutely understand that. I think that, you know, my hope is that over the coming years, we'll see greater alignment and greater consolidation of reporting frameworks. And so I kind of make myself feel better by thinking that this is a short-term pain period, you know, in terms of, you know, in the future, there will be greater degrees of alignment and consolidation. And certainly that's the direction of travel that we're seeing.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on a point that Jane made earlier about roles and responsibilities. And I think what we've found fascinating is that actually transition planning is asking both boards and executives questions about how you structure for sustainability. Both in one context, you know, we discussed, should that board actually set up an ESG committee? Or is this actually a full board and a full committee agenda, which of course it is, but how you approach that. And in one case, we decided actually it would stay within risk. And then conversely, you know, where does it sit within the executive? And again, in one particular case, the organization actually looked at a slight restructure around putting scopes 1, 2, and 3 together structurally within the executive. So those are examples of quite how profound transition planning can be in thinking about how we approach these issues.
And I think also because it's still early stages, it's a real opportunity for NEDs who have a good interest in this area to almost put their hand up. And that's what I've done on 2 of my boards, to say, I really feel passionate. I am putting in effort to understand this better, and therefore almost take the lead around it. So my advice would be, if this is of interest, just jump into it rather than waiting for a more formal structure to pull you in then on your boards. But Vicky, just continuing the conversation about boardroom discussions, what else? What are some of the other key things you've seen as part of the discussions with boards around transition planning?
You know, what's really interesting is the inbound chapter 0 around support for board development sessions, which actually we can't offer at the moment, but I think it's a trend. And I think a way to, you know, Jane mentioned earlier, or was it Julie, that, you know, sometimes it can be harder to get this on the board agenda, but actually a really good way in is to work with that company secretary to think about board development sessions and that education piece with board directors, because once they're across this, then the thing will start to flow out from there.
I'd agree, actually, Vicky, if I may just jump in. I think that one of the potential barriers to having a meaningful conversation about this is the fact that there's a lot to know. And I think that many, you know, I think diversity of thought is brilliant, but it's really important that, you know, when you get to the point of having a conversation and completing the scorecard, it's done with sufficient knowledge to be able to do that. I think that early sort of board briefing, the first bit of the toolkit's really important, so that, you know, there is that sort of degree of understanding across the board to be able to inform an informed conversation and an informed debate. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, we've had, sorry, Devyani, we've
go ahead. Yeah.
had consistent and excellent feedback on that briefing. And if there's one thing you do, I would encourage you to use that briefing just to get the board across, what this is, and that could be very helpful. Back to you.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, Vicky, I think Chapter Zero also is doing a great job in terms of helping NEDs almost upskill themselves and have a community that you can talk to. So just wanted you to talk through a little more about what it's doing so that folks on the call who maybe are not as familiar with Chapter Zero understand how they could become members and use it as a resource to get themselves more familiar.
Thank you, Devyani. I mean, we are philanthropically funded, and so we are free of charge to members. We have a non-executive director community, as well as an associate membership for senior executives who are perhaps transitioning into their NED career. So we welcome you to bring on your board colleagues. I mean, actually, our theory of change is that if your board colleagues are members of Chapter Zero, we hope that your boardroom conversations will be easier because there'll be more educated people at the table. In terms of how you can engage, we offer all sorts of events like this, which are all published on our website. And we offer our Knowledge Hub, which we have fantastic feedback on, which is all about briefing for the non-executive director audience across all topics of climate.
Great. And Jane, what advice would you have for anyone wanting now to use a toolkit, or may have either to start thinking or maybe in the early stages?
Well, there's the obvious one about kind of don't wait. I think it's really important just to get going. And I think that really it's about making sure that, and the toolkits, the scorecard's a great place for this, is just really getting to the questions that are going to tell you the truth about the company that you're overseeing. So, some of these, I guess it's easier for an organization to set an ambition and set a target. Actually, some of the evidence of whether an organization is truly embedding climate into its decision making are the questions which focus on strategic planning, financial planning, location strategy. So really trying to work out whether an organization does actually think about climate in the context of its future long-term success, as well as its kind of planning today. So I think it's really important for NEDs to think about what are the critical questions that I can ask, which will start to reveal the extent to which an organization really is getting a handle on this. And I think it's really important that there is a clear expectation from boards to executive teams that, there's an expectation there's a robust plan in place. Because this is increasingly important to allocators of capital, whether that's debt or equity. It's very important that there is a clear and strong rationale and an answer going forward. And the other point to make is that this is system-wide change, and therefore no sector can say doesn't apply to us. I mean, we're a financial markets infrastructure and data company, and I can tell you that the vast majority of our revenue from our customers is linked in some way to commitments that they have made around sustainability and climate. And therefore, it's in our interest to understand what our customers are trying to grapple with and what they're trying to deliver. So some of the world's biggest financial institutions, we can help them, and we need to be on that journey with them. So this is very pertinent to commercial strategies, as well as kind of managing risk as well. So this is not just a risk conversation. I think it's a risk and opportunity. And I think the extent to which we can be thinking about the value creation opportunities makes this actually a really interesting area to talk about as well.
Yeah, and sorry to put you on the spot, but is there an example you can give? I mean, you mentioned a very powerful word about questions that actually address the truth, and therefore not just focusing on risk, but also the opportunity. Is there an actual example you can share with us about, how you did that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we, from our perspective, we recognize that providing sustainable finance solutions to our customers is a value creation opportunity for us. And we need to see it in the context that actually our changing climate is creating that opportunity for us. And it's not just an opportunity. We feel as if it's a responsibility, because actually our customers rely on us to be able to have fit for purpose data and market infrastructure available to deliver. So that's an opportunity. And I think the more that the boards have those conversations, the better. And indeed, just at the end of the last year, we had a very good conversation with the board around our sustainable finance approach and what we're doing and what we hope to do in the future, and some of some of the kind of things that we need to work through to be able to really kind of achieve that ambition.
Right, that's really interesting. And Vicky, how would you suggest NEDs or anyone on the call use this with their own boards? So any advice, any suggestions?
Yes, well, I would first of all take the briefing as part of the toolkit, and I think that can be used for everyone really. The company secretary usually would like that, and that can just be sent out. I think in terms of the scorecard, which is now interactive, what we're hearing from the chair's point of view, which we haven't discussed so much yet, is actually chairs need to have a good discussion in the boardroom, and they need to pull out those polarities of debate. They need a forum to have that rich discussion. And I think that what the scorecard can do is actually pull out those polarities and see where the different directors and the different committee chairs and the whole board are pulling apart. And actually knowing that as soon as possible begins that strategic journey. So we are finding from the chair's point of view, that scorecard is very useful. I think the other thing is that the framing of this opportunity, to respond to your point, Jane, I think we have to recognize that there will be winners and losers, and that this is actually a commercial opportunity. And I think in climate, there's been a lot of talking about devastation and disaster, but actually, if the capital investment that's needed is injected as fast as we hope it will be, we are transforming our economy, and there will be, huge opportunity here. And I think there needs to be more discussion around that opportunity now. I think that's where we are.
Well, that's been really, really interesting. And I think I'm actually getting even more excited about the toolkit now than I had earlier. But I do think it's a great opportunity to translate something that's aspirational, probably a little conceptual, into something more specific, pragmatic, and implementable. So, and hopefully, as I said, over the next few months, the wealth of information and data that Chapter 0 will now hold on how boards are actually using it and their own experiences will add to the richness of information available. So I can see the Q&A has been quite active. So Mark, at this stage, I'm going to hand over to you to answer questions that are being raised by folks on the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Devyani. What a great conversation you've all had. I think, well, as you said, Devyani, it's quite inspiring actually to hear about how this can really be used as a tool to drive transformational change within companies and ultimately across the wider economy. I was at an event recently where a number of the companies that have already started using the TPT framework were telling some of their stories, and they really did emphasize how it has changed the way of thinking within their organizations, built new connections across different functions, and really brought buy-in to both the need to transform and the actions that can then be taken. So a real opportunity for you all to take these discussions into your boardrooms with the support of the TPT framework and the toolkit, and really get that transformational mindset in place. But let's turn to the Q&A. Thanks so much for returning, Julie, Rory, Jane. There are a number of questions have already come through over the past hour or so. So I'll launch straight in because time is of the essence. I'll start with an interesting question that's posed to yourself, Rory. Do investors expect advocacy from the board in its entirety or on a limited basis from sustainability-oriented or sustainability-focused members? That's a really, really interesting question. I think we've, at Chapter Zero, given a very strong message that transition planning is a strategic endeavour for the whole board. But I'd love to get your perspective on that, Rory, and from the investor community generally, as you see it.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So I think there are three sort of strands to this, two of which relate to people and one of which relates to structure. So on the people point, the first is board members don't just meet investors in set piece events like the AGM or the roadshow. Board members represent their company, at meetings and so forth. So the first point is that the point around advocacy is representing your company. Do you as a board member represent your company and stand up for it and praise it when you're out and about in meetings and talking with others? So the first point is you have a responsibility as a board member to do that. The second point is, and this is for the professional NEDs on the call who are building careers as NEDs, investors judge you every time they meet you. If they see you, and if one day you're pretending to be supporting TPT and the next day you're bad-mouthing the company, or you go, I don't really believe in this climate stuff, or being a bit skeptical about it, just know people are judging you. Your views and your approach to climate change is seen as a sign of how well you engage with new and emerging risk and challenges for the business. So to be very blunt, your role as an NED is to represent the company or the companies whose boards you're on. You also are representing yourself, and you're representing yourself to future employers who are going to have a say about whether or not you should get those lucrative board positions in the future. Mark, if I may just deal with structure, because it was the follow-on question on this point about representation. There is no particular right way on how to organise sustainability at the board level. Some organisations have gone for committees because they have lots of work and they need an entity to do it. Others have retained it within the board. The point I did want to make, if I may, is that boards are unitary structures. The premise of company law in most countries is the board collectively owns the decisions that are made. So yes, boards can have committees where work gets done and detail gets scrutinized. Boards as a whole need to own the decision. Transition planning is all about strategy and it's all about CapEx. Do not tell me that a board should not own those decisions individually and collectively. So I think there's a really important point. Structure is about how you do this work efficiently and effectively and practically. It is the board responsibility collectively, and it is the responsibility of board members individually to own that decision and then to positively communicate it.
Brilliant. Very nicely put, Rory. Julie, I'm sure you've got a perspective on this as well, from within a board. And maybe when you respond to this one, if you could perhaps also touch on a slightly related question around use of the scorecard in a whole of board setting. There was a question there around individual responses by individual board members and how you can aggregate up to get a good perspective on how the board as a whole is thinking about all of this. So please, if I could invite you in, Julie.
Thank you. Yes, just to build on what Rory said, because I completely agree with everything he said. In practical terms, the direct interaction that boards have with investors comes through the roadshows, which tend to be led by the CEO and the CFO, possibly the chair, but for many companies, even the chair is not at the roadshows. And the other main interaction is the remuneration committee chair, who definitely has direct face-to-face contact with investors. So I would say two things, in addition to Rory's point about generally, promoting your company in the right way wherever you are. I think that the board rehearsing the Capital Markets Day presentations with the people who are going to deliver them and really getting those messages right around transition planning is because they probably won't be there in the room, or I mean, we're invited to attend, but we're not on the platform. But getting those messages right and getting that presentation right is, I think, absolutely fundamental, because not all chief executives and CFOs have got that experience. And the other thing is, for the REM chair, you know, if you're in the room, I mean, I've chaired lots of remuneration committees, and typically now, as we've seen from all the data, most companies do have emissions related or sustainability, ESG related metrics in their plans. And what I've found when I'm dealing with the investors is they start to ask loads of questions about things that are not about incentives particularly, but, you know, how did you come up with this? How do you know this is a stretching target? How does this fit with your business strategy? What impacts is this going to have on other aspects of your business? So any remuneration committee chairs in this call, my advice would be just really get on top of the transition pathway that your company is going to take, because you will find yourself sucked into conversations with investors. And you can't say, I don't know the answer. You absolutely need to know the answer. And obviously we need to have known the answer to set the targets, but it's a bit of we're on a bit of a journey, I think, all of us, on setting remuneration targets. So that would be counsel on that. In terms of the scorecard, there was a question about consolidating results from the board. At the moment, what we've put in place is it only gives you an individual depiction of your result. We don't know who else has filled in the scorecard from your board, but your company secretary can know. So it's not rocket science to consolidate the results, because it's just a numeric, you know, add them up and draw out the contrast. So my advice would be on the use of the scorecard, get as many people as possible to complete it in different parts of the organization. You know, why can't the people in the finance function complete it and tell us what they're thinking about all of this stuff? And then ask the company secretary or some other person that you designate to take all of those results, consolidate them so you get some, you know, an overall picture, but also draw out the differences because no one's going to know who's filled in which scorecard. But, you know, if somebody scored something 1 and somebody else has scored it 5, then you know there's a really interesting conversation to have. So that would be what I would suggest. I mean, maybe at some point in the future, we might do it a different way automatically, but it doesn't take a lot of time to do it. And I think just the process of putting it all together gives the company secretary and the chair quite good insight. You know, they have to think through, what are we going to draw out of this discussion?
And just to jump in very, very quickly, if you don't mind, just to say that the one of the great features of the scorecard is that there's 2 versions. There's the light touch version, which is just 8 questions, and then there's the more detailed version, which is 20 questions. So really, it couldn't be more practical, because actually there's, you know, catering for different audiences. So so if 20 questions seems too much, then go for the getting started version. It's just 8.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Jane. So hopefully some good practical advice there for members on the call. Just keeping on the investor scrutiny theme and what that means for how boards approach this. We've had a couple of questions on, first of all, is it just institutional investors that are focusing on this? Maybe you can pick that one up, Rory. And there's also a question around whether we've seen evidence of the toolkit being used by private equity backed boards. I don't know, Julie, if you've perhaps got a perspective on that.
Okay, while Julie's gathering her thoughts, Mark, I'll take the investor question. So I would say so far, institutional investors have been the ones who have paid most attention and been most engaged with the discussions around transition planning. But I think it's because transition planning is an evolving area, and most of the discussions have been about what should they contain, etc. So I think we're moving out of that field. or out of that space into one where these start getting produced and people can start using them. I think one of the questions that got out, sort of the context for the question you've asked is also around AGMs. And I did want to make a point, which is, and Julie, you made a similar point in your comments. Investors engage with companies at a variety of points over the calendar year. So the AGM tends to be the point where companies engage directly with their smaller or private investors. And that's a very valuable public forum for raising concerns on the floor and so on. Big institutions will have multiple touch points over the year. They'll often may not even be at the AGM, will have discussed their votes in advance with the company. They'll have done roadshows. They'll have done engagement. So I think so Mark, to your question is, thus far, big institutions have been more interested. The information will allow others to engage in dialogue. But I think just to the person who asked the question, it's understanding that the AGM is a very set piece event, and big institutions have lots of other points that they dialogue with companies. And what we are seeing, and Jane, you may have some reflections on this from your experience as well, is increasingly the responsible investment or sustainability person is an integral part of those discussions. Historically, I think they were a bit on the side, or they had one question at the end of meetings. I think increasingly we're seeing the big institutions going into companies talking about strategy and talking about CapEx and talking about risk. And clearly all of those are areas where climate-related risks and opportunities are important.
Yeah, I would definitely concur, Rory, where I'm seeing investors all the time now. I mean, and we're seeing that as a year-on-year increase, definitely. And because I'm counting, I'm keeping track of how many investors are actually asking for meetings, which is quite frequent, but also just kind of written questions as well, periodically, just wanting to get a kind of sense of a specific question. And often the remuneration question is coming up as well. That seems to be a much more kind of frequent question that we're fielding about, not just the fact that there's an ESG kind of metric or KPI in the remuneration, but actually, whether that's quite right. Are the KPIs the right KPIs to be having? Are we measuring the right things? I think on that, I would just say that, we don't have perfect answers right now, because, data is a really important part of this whole conundrum, and measuring progress on climate transition plans is kind of based on having the right data in place and be able to measure that correctly.
Let's come back to that, because there's a very relevant question to that to that very point. But Julie, did you want to come in on the private equity backed boards question?
Yeah, just briefly, and first on the privately owned, because I found it very interesting. Family-owned businesses are taking a real interest in this, and many family-owned businesses are really focused on their legacy, and they're focused on a longer-term time horizon. So I don't think we should think that just because the listing rules require certain things of listed companies that private businesses, in the sense of family-owned, are not going to be part of this. And the direction of travel is that large companies, the pies, as they call them, are going to be embraced anyway, whatever the ownership. I think the private equity world is very, very interesting. If you'd asked the question certainly 2 years ago, I would have said that they are really lagging behind in terms of the debate in the boardroom. But actually, some of the big private equity houses are really taking a grip of this, and they're very, very focused on it. And of course, they're really smart, these people. So, I mean, you only have to look at the fact that Bain Capital bought Guidehouse, which is one of the leading advisors in this area. They're shelling out real money, and then they're using those Guidehouse consultants to actually, go into the boardroom. And it's one of the things, if I may just take another of the questions slightly. So one of the questions was, how do we get over the cognitive bias and get the discussions happening in the right way? And one of the things I found most effective for my boards is where you get expert input from people who really know what they're talking about. And certainly the Guidehouse guys, and you know, we've had Schneider Electric talking about how you make your factories more efficient. You know, these are specialists, and they come into the boardroom, and it creates a very different quality of conversation. And a brilliant one a week ago where we had experts on the built environment coming in and giving examples of how, you know, the low carbon cement and steel and, you know, what's being done in that area completely opened the eyes of the board members, many of whom are really quite knowledgeable about construction and property. But you know, the fact that 60% of your emissions in a lifetime of a building are in the structure, in the construction, not the operation, you know, things like this are very, very helpful for the conversation. So I think we're going to see a lot more action on the part of private equity. I think they'll come at it with, you know, the smarts that they bring to things, and they'll want to see real results out of this. I mean, quite rightly, they'll want to see real returns. They're not going to change their view on that. So mapping, as Vicky said earlier, the commercials, you know, onto this is really important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, I mean, the last few interventions from you all have really honed in on that scrutiny and that holding to account. Ultimately, for me, that suggests that there's a question here around emerging evidence that organisations are lowballing their disclosures to game the process. And that's not going to be sustainable, is it, if investors are taking that strong a stance in this area, and if they're really going to be putting transition plans under scrutiny. We're also seeing quite a lot of work happening at the moment. The World Benchmarking Alliance, for instance, are doing a lot of work on assessing the credibility of transition plans. Jane, you're very involved at LSEG in the Transition Pathway Initiative. Perhaps I could go to you first, Jane, and then then maybe Rory and Julie would like to supplement. How do you see this opportunity to gain? Is it going to be very, very short-lived?
I'm not entirely sure we see widespread lowballing, so I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief. I'm sure that some companies may be taking a cautious approach, and they may be taking a position where they are cautious about what they disclose in the public domain for fear of maybe not being able to achieve. So I think potentially there may be some of that, and that's understandable. I think that the more we can get to transition plans which are honest and open about the risk and the opportunity that's present and the challenges of both mitigating that risk and crystallizing the opportunity, the quicker we can make a plan which is open and honest, that is what is useful to investors, because that informs a conversation and a debate. I think that it would be wrong if we are trying to achieve climate transition plans which are perfect and have all the answers, because if we wait for that, we will be waiting a very long time. And I think that, you know, there is perhaps a view that it's not okay to publish the answer, we're still working on it. I think that's entirely, absolutely right to be able to say that. And we've done that ourselves. We've done that ourselves in part to be able to demonstrate that we think it's okay to do it. Because no organisation is going to have this all sewn up. So just a quick example from ours. We have been doing some work over the last few months around physical climate risk. And the first part of that was to do a baseline assessment of our kind of global footprint of, you know, of data centres and office networks, etc., across the world. That provided a first look at kind of what some of the regions are particularly going to be exposed in different climate scenarios. There is now follow-on work that needs to be done to sort of deep dive into some of those specific regions to really, you know, in a more detailed way, understand whether or not that first phase of analysis actually kind of what we need to do about it. So none of this can be done and dusted in a year, right? So this is an ongoing process, and by that very point, it means that there are going to be parts of the plan which is work in progress. So that was just my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the TPT says right up front in the guidance, this has to be an iterative, dynamic, flexible process. And and as somebody said at the TPT launch event last year at LSEG, we've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and that is a bit of a mindset shift. Very quick supplements, Rory, Julie.
Yeah, I might come in on that, Mark, because I think the debate around reporting more generally has suffered from the same kind of characterization, and probably actually quite lazy characterization that the question presented. Sort of presenting this as some kind of game where companies lowball and investors highball and there's a contest. I mean, that is not how to think about reporting. I think Jane's analysis is exactly right. This is about a grown-up discussion between companies and their investors. We don't have all the answers. Investors don't have all the answers, nor do companies. So it's about setting that up. In my slides where I talked about what the document needs to do and then what the dialogue needs to do are really important in that regard. I would say, so just again, back onto my words of warning, it seems to be my recurring theme of the day. Companies that put out weak reports with not credible targets. So I think lowballing and highballing have similar characteristics. So the targets and the analysis need to be credible and thoughtful and worked through. Investors are really good at cutting through. You know, if you put out stuff that's not credible, it's either hugely, wildly overambitious or completely reductionistly unambitious, investors will see through that. And I thought Julie's points about this kind of and I think also Vicky in the earlier discussion around the nature of the dialogue between investors and companies shows the danger of trying to talk about stuff that's not true or that's inaccurate. Investors want to know what measures, KPIs, targets, etc. do you have? How are they derived? Are they appropriate? Are they credible, etc.? So this focus, and Jane, I thought your comments were exactly right. This is about a grown-up discussion between grown-up investors and grown-up companies. Companies consistently say they want investors who are long-term, thoughtful about strategy, supportive of management when change is needed, and stick with them. You do not get that if you, I was going to use an expletive, but I realized the call is being recorded. If you try and bluff investors or pretend to be something you're not. Transition planning, and you're right, Mark, the forward to it is, this is about a dialogue. It's the basis for a grown-up discussion between companies who want to be successful long-term and investors who want and need them to be successful. Presenting reporting as anything other than enabling and supporting that dialogue means that companies will fail to realize any substantive benefits from transition planning reporting, and in fact may undermine their attractiveness to the exact type of investors they want to attract.
Thank you very much, Rory. Julie, very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think this is probably our last soundbite. But you know, I'm really interested in this question. I mean, the first thing I would say is we don't see any gaming in that sense. We don't get that in what we're looking at. I think what we do see, which is still a real issue, is a level of sort of resistance within the board and a lack of recognition of the impact that this is going to have on some companies that may not see themselves as being in the frame, or they don't see the level of impact that they might be facing. So I don't think that's gaming. I think people genuinely haven't yet understood quite how significant some of this might be, whether it be physical risk or transition risk, and or the opportunities for that matter. We tend to plan incrementally. We tend to, you know, add to last year. This is a whole new way of thinking about the future of some businesses. So I would highlight that. But if I could just finish, because it's a real obsession of mine, is this thing about ambition. You know, I've been in the business of business transformation all my career, as a consultant, and then as a executive director, and then as a non-exec of companies that have been doing big transformations. It's absolutely the case that if you don't set an ambition, you certainly won't get there. So my argument is, let's not discourage companies from being ambitious. And that's what happened sort of 2 years, 3 years ago in terms of when we would, and countries for that matter, when we would get to net zero by, this date or that date. I don't think being ambitious is wrong. I think being ambitious sets the sights high, but then of course you've got to do the proper planning. You've got to do the interim milestones. You've got to map out the journey. You've got to engage the whole organization in this journey because it's going to affect everybody. So all those good practices around transforming businesses need to come into play. So I don't criticize the companies that went ambitious and then find they've had to slightly come back from that. And I think investors are pretty tuned in to that. But if we set a low ambition, we certainly won't reach the goal that we all need to get to together.
Beautiful way to end. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to some of the other excellent questions. There were a number there on the role of the public sector here, and how the public and the private sectors need to work together. I think those are really, really important topics that it would be great if we can perhaps come back and discuss with members on a future call, because that's an area that I'm personally doing a bit of work on in a research project with the London School of Economics at the moment, building from the TPT. So that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you all so much for excellent responses to the questions. And let's go back to Vicky for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and to everybody. What a fascinating discussion. Just a few words of summary from me. First of all, we hope that you find the Transition Planning Toolkit from Chapter 0 helpful. Please have a look at it, and we would welcome any feedback on making it better. That would be helpful to us. Secondly, we are launching, as of next month, a dedicated transition planning series of roundtable discussions, events, and further webinars that will take you through some of those stages in the framework in context of our peer-to-peer community. And we'll be launching that programme shortly, and please have a look out for that. And we hope that you'll sign up and share that with your colleagues to help us all get into the depth and detail and breadth of this fascinating and important topic. I think the final point from me is really that we talk about radical collaboration, and it's at risk of becoming a bit of a jargon word. But one of the fascinating things about the transition planning approach is that it does ask the entity to think about its impact on the wider economy and society. So thinking outside of its sort of monolithic edges and becoming more porous and thinking in that way. And I think this collaboration is central, and what we can offer at Chapter 0 is a peer-to-peer community where we can collaborate, where we can knock our heads together, where we can share the difficulties, the opportunities, in a context where directors can come together. And so we do welcome you into our community. We welcome your peers on your boards, and we hope that together we can find the practical examples now to actually make transition planning a reality in transforming our economies. So thank you very much to all of our expert speakers today. Thank you to our members and for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in May for the next series of transition planning. Thank you. Goodbye.